Now, when he had marched over that desert which lies between Egypt and Syria, in the manner forementioned, he came to Caesarea, having resolved to set his forces in order at that place. And as he was about to march to Jerusalem, he took with him 600 chosen horsemen, and went to take a view of the city, and to observe what strength it was of, and how courageous the Jewish people were. As he was riding along with his chosen men, a great number of the Jewish enemy, who were placed in arms, sallied out, and got between him and those that followed him, insomuch that he was left alone, with a very few about him. He had no helmet, nor breastplate, for he was not gone out to fight, but to view the city. Yet did he not stop the speed of his horse, nor turn it about, but galloped through the midst of his enemies, and made his way through them, without receiving the least wound. That was Josephus, Jewish War, Book 5, Chapter 2. In the first week of spring, 70 AD, a 30-year-old Roman general called Titus Flavius Vespasianus rode up to the walls of Jerusalem to look at the city he had been sent to destroy. He took 600 picked cavalry and no infantry escort. He wore no helmet, he wore no body armor, he was not there to fight. He was there to look. Jewish strike force came out of one of the gates and cut his column in half. Titus, son of the emperor of Rome, the heir of the Flavian dynasty, the commander of 4 full legions encamped a day's ride behind him, was, for the space of about 3 minutes, hiding for his own life, with no armor and almost no men. Josephus tells us he rode straight through the Jewish line. He did not turn the horse. He did not draw the rein. He did not. And this is the detail that lands the hardest: appear to receive a single wound. He rode back to the camp, ordered the legions forward, and the siege of Jerusalem began. This is episode 5, the fall of Jerusalem, Josephus, and the end of the world. I'm Nat. Welcome back inside the walls. A note on the shape of this episode before we begin. Episode 1, 2, and 3 walked you up to the wall. Episode 4 walked you through the civil war inside the walls, the false messiahs, and the death of Ananias. This episode is a part of the story most people think of when they think of the destruction of Jerusalem, but it isn't the destruction itself. That's episode 6. This episode is the slow tightening of the noose, the arrival of the Roman war machine, the too late unity of the 3 Jewish factions, the construction of a wall around the city that turned starvation into a weapon, the famine, the crucifixions, the pleas of one terrified Jewish historian standing outside the walls of his own city, begging his own people to listen. It is part of the story Josephus could not write without breaking the page. We will read his own words where the strain really shows. So let's go. In our last episode, we left Vespasian in late 69 AD, holding the eastern provinces, watching Rome burn through 3 emperors in 18 months, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and being proclaimed emperor by his own legions in July. By December 69, Vitellius was dead in a Roman street, and Vespasian was the undisputed master of the Roman world. He left Judea, he sailed for Alexandria, and then for Rome to consolidate his throne, leaving the conclusion of the Jewish war to his eldest son. Titus was, at this point, 30 years old. He had been raised in the imperial palace alongside the son of Claudius. He had served under his father through the campaigns of 67, 68, and 69. He had personally led the assault that took Josephus in July 67, the assault that captured a 30-year-old Jewish general called Josephus ben Matthias. Titus had known Josephus for nearly 3 years by the time he marched on Jerusalem, and in the spring of 70 AD, Titus brought him along. Titus marched south from Caesarea with 4 legions, the 5th Macedonica, the 10th Reconnaissance, 12th Fulminata, yes, the same 12th that had lost the eagle at Beth Horon in November 66 AD, and now had 3.5 years of disgrace to wash off. The 15th Apollinaris, with them came auxiliary forces from every Roman client kingdom in the east, Agrippa's second troops, the Commagenian forces of Antiochus IV, the Amazon archers of Suemus, the Nabetian cavalry of King Malchus II. The total force, Josephus reports, is somewhere between 60 and 80,000 men. They marched on Jerusalem in the second week of Nisan. They timed it for Passover. A quick gloss on what that means. Passover is the great pilgrimage festival of the Jewish year. In the first century, Jews from every corner of the diaspora, Babylon, Egypt, Asia Minor, Greece, and Rome, traveled to Jerusalem to celebrate it at the temple. The population of the city, normally around 80,000, swelled at Passover to something extraordinary. Josephus's own figures suggest more than 1 million people inside the walls. Tacitus, writing independently, gives 600,000. Modern historians are skeptical of both numbers, but everyone agrees that in the spring of 70 AD, Jerusalem was the most overcrowded city in the Roman East. Some historians have argued that Titus timed his arrival deliberately to maximize the number of mouths inside the city and accelerate the famine. Josephus doesn't say so explicitly, but the calendar of Roman campaigning meant that the spring offensive was always going to be around Passover, and Titus made no effort to delay it. He arrived on the eve of the festival. The Romans had finally got their act together after their own civil war. Inside the walls, the Jews were still running multiple competing governments. It was peak ancient project management, and riding behind the 10th Legion with no command and no weapons was Joseph ben Matthias. He was 33 years old. He had spent nearly 3 years in Roman custody. He had been used as an interpreter during the campaigns of 68 and 69, and he had been freed from his chains by Vespasian the day Vespasian was proclaimed emperor. He was now technically a Roman citizen. Titus Flavius Josephus, a member of the Flavian household, but his usefulness to Titus was a Jewish voice, a man who could speak Aramaic and Greek and the formal Hebrew of the priesthood, a man who could stand outside the walls and shout to the defenders in their own language. Titus brought him in for that. Josephus would speak from the Roman side with Roman intentions in the voice of his own people. He would be ignored. He would be mocked. He would be shot at. His own father would be imprisoned by John Gischala's men inside the city to punish him. He would, in his account, decades later, never quite stop pleading. That, in the spring of 70 AD, was Josephus's war. Inside Jerusalem, the moment Titus arrived, something extraordinary happened. The three tyrants stopped fighting each other. It had taken them nearly 2 years of street battles and burned grain stores and tortured families to reach this point. It had taken the literal sight of Roman legionary standards on surrounding hills. By the second day of Passover, John Gischala's men and Simon Bar Giara's men were no longer pointing weapons at each other. They were pointing weapons at the walls. The factions had finally united, mostly so they could all starve together. One detail of how unity came about deserves to be noted because it's one of the darkest moments in the whole Jewish war. Eleazar, the son of Simon, the zealot priest holding the inner temple, the third faction we met in episode 4, was eliminated by John of Gischala during the Passover festival itself. On the day the gates of the inner sanctuary were opened to admit pilgrims for the festival sacrifices, John's men entered the inner court disguised as worshippers. They carried weapons concealed in their robes. They massacred Eleazar's zealots inside the holy precincts. This is recorded in Jewish War Book 5, Chapter 3. Quote, "They came in like other Jews, but with a design of slaughter. They drew their swords and slew not only those that were before them, but also their own kinsmen, who were of the same faction." Unquote. John of Gischala took control of the inner temple by killing the men who had been holding it. He did it on Passover. He did it inside the sanctuary, the temple platform, the most sacred space in Judaism, became, on the holiest week of the Jewish year, the scene of a faction murder. And then, with one fewer rival inside the walls, John of Gischala and Simon Bar Giora joined forces against Titus. The defending army was perhaps 23,000 fighting men. John commanded around 6,000. Simon Bar Giora commanded around 15,000. The remaining Idumean contingent that had marched in during the winter storm 2 years earlier added perhaps 2,000 more, against 4 legions and their auxiliaries, outnumbered roughly 3-1. But behind the walls, Josephus in Jewish War Book 5 gives us one of the most detailed descriptions of the city defenses that survives from antiquity. We will run through it quickly because the geography matters for everything else that follows. Jerusalem had 3 defensive walls. The first wall, the oldest, enclosed the upper city and the lower city. It dated in parts to the time of King David and Solomon, repaired and rebuilt by the Hasmoneans and by Herod. It ran from the temple platform around the older neighborhoods and back. It was the strongest part of the 3, with massive masonry blocks and 3 great towers Herod had built at its weakest section. Hippicus, Faisal, and Miriamni, towers so strong that the Romans, after the city fell, deliberately left them standing as monuments to their own siege. The second wall protected the suburbs to the north of the first wall. It dated from the Hasmonean period. It was newer, less massive, with 7 gates, but still a serious obstacle. The third wall was the newest and longest, and in some ways the strangest. It had begun by Agrippa I in the early 40s AD to protect the northern suburbs. The area called Bezitha, the new city, had been abandoned by Herod under Roman pressure. The rebels finished it in 66 and 67 AD. By 70 AD, it was complete. 5 miles perimeter, 10 feet thick, 90 towers along its length. 3 concentric defenses, north-facing, because of the topography of Jerusalem, only rarely allows an army to approach from the north. The south, east, and west are protected by steep ravines. Titus had to break in from the north, and he had to break, in succession, 3 walls. The image of the 3 Jewish factions, after years of self-destruction, finally locking shields against a common enemy, too late with the walls in sight of Roman engines, is not an image confined to 70 AD. It is an image you've been watching on the news for the last several years. Israel by 2026 is, by any honest accounting, a deeply divided country. The religious right wing pushing for Temple Mount access, the centrist establishment trying to preserve the 1994 status quo with Jordan, the secular left pushing back on both. Knesset coalitions have formed and collapsed and reformed, and around it all, the multi-front pressure, Hezbollah to the north, the Houthi access on the shipping lanes, Iranian-backed militias on 3 borders, the Iran-Israel conflict that has now run hot and cold for years. In moments of acute external threat, after they struck Iran earlier this year, Iran has been directly striking them. There's a large escalation on the Lebanese border. The factions have repeatedly closed ranks. In moments of relative calm, they have repeatedly fractured again. Josephus knew the pattern. He spent 2,500 pages writing about it, and his warning was not that external enemies are unreal. They were extremely real. His warning was that the only enemy capable of finishing the job is the one already inside the walls. I'm not predicting, I'm noticing a pattern. The book is open. You can read it for yourself. Titus broke the third wall first. He brought up 3 siege banks, earthen ramps faced with timber, on which his battering rams could climb. The largest ram, nicknamed by Roman soldiers the Conqueror, began work on the section of the third wall closest to the camp of the 12th Fulminata. After 15 days of pounding on roughly the 7th of May, the third wall came down. The defenders fell back into the suburbs of the second wall. The Romans entered the new city and burned it. 5 days later, the second wall fell. Titus stood inside the second concentric ring. He could see ahead of him the Antonia fortress, the temple platform, and the towers of the first wall. And then he stopped. 4 days he did nothing. He paid his troops in full. He ordered a military parade, a deliberate, intimidating display in full view of the Jewish defenders on the wall. He sent Josephus forward in the voice of his own people with terms of peace. Josephus's great speech outside the wall is preserved in length in the Jewish War, Book 5, Chapter 9. He stood within shouting distance of the towers. He named men who he had known. He invoked Abraham, Moses, Hezekiah, the return from Babylon. He begged, "Why have you not regard to the destruction of your country and to the burning of the temple, which is yet hovering over you? Will you not, even now, come to your senses?" Defenders shot arrows at him. They mocked him from the towers. They accused him of being a Roman lickspittle, which, in technical terms, he was. They called him a traitor, which, in technical terms, he also was. None of that meant his pleading was wrong. John of Gischala's men dragged Josephus's elderly father out into the streets and imprisoned him as a warning. They had Josephus's brother killed. They had every member of his household they could find tortured. Josephus, when he writes this in Rome a decade later, doesn't flinch from it. He records what they did to his family. He records what they shouted at him. He records with the dry control of a man who has run out of tears that he kept on speaking until his voice gave out. Titus, when the speeches failed, did something that may be the most strategically brilliant and morally horrifying decision of the entire campaign. He built a wall. Titus ordered the construction of a complete circumvallation, a Roman engineering term for a defensive wall built around a city under siege to prevent escape and supply. The wall ran roughly 4.5 miles or about 7 kilometers around the entire perimeter of Jerusalem, sealing the south, east, and west approaches and locking the rebels and the Passover pilgrims and the civilian population inside with no way out. Josephus reports that the wall was completed in 3 days. Modern engineers regard this figure with some skepticism. The Roman army of the first century could in fact build at that pace. Caesar's circumvallation at Eleazar in 52 BC, 2 centuries earlier, had been an even more ambitious version of the same technique. The atrocities Josephus catalogues from inside the city in late May and June of 70 AD are difficult to read. Families killing each other for hidden caches of food, soldiers torturing civilians on suspicion that they had eaten in private, children gnawing on leather belts, women combing through dung heaps for undigested grain. The wealthier citizens who tried to escape over the walls at night, hoping to surrender to the Romans, swallowed gold coins to smuggle them past the rebel patrols. And then, after being captured by Syrian auxiliaries outside the walls, being cut open by those same auxiliaries for the gold inside their bellies. Titus, when he discovered this practice, executed several of his own auxiliary publicly and forbade it. The practice continued in secret. The Roman policy on captured escapees was crucifixion. Josephus reports that between 500 and 700 Jews were caught and crucified every day in the side of the walls for weeks. The Romans actually ran out of wood. They ran out of crosses. They began crucifying their victims in different poses for entertainment. By midsummer, Josephus says, the trees of the surrounding hills had been cut down for 90 stadia in every direction, about 10 miles or 15 kilometers, to build siege works and crosses. And then there's the story of Mary of Bethsaida, a horrifying story to be sure, and if you're sensitive, maybe skip this part. Inside the city somewhere, in the upper neighborhoods, a woman named Mary. Josephus gives her name in full. Mary, daughter of Eleazar, from the village of Bethsaida, beyond the Jordan, had taken refuge with her infant son. She was wealthy. She had brought possessions with her from the country. The rebel patrols had stripped her repeatedly of food, of clothing, of anything she had. By July, she had nothing left. She had not eaten in days. The infant was past crying. Josephus tells us, and I'm going to quote him here. This is one of the passages where his control breaks. What happened next? Quote, she then attempted a most unnatural thing, and snatching up her son, who was a child sucking at her breast, she said, O thou miserable infant, for whom shall I preserve thee in this war, this famine, and this sedition? As to the war with the Romans, if they preserve our lives, we must be slaves. This famine also will destroy us, even before that slavery comes upon us. Yet are these seditious rogues more terrible than both the other? Come on, be thou my food, and be thou fury to those seditious varlets, and a byword to the world. As soon as she said this, she slew her son, and then roasted him, and ate the one half of him, and kept the other half by her concealed. The rebel patrols smelled the cooking. They broke in. They demanded the food. Mary uncovered the remains of her son. Josephus tells us that the rebels, hardened men, the kind of men who had spent 2 years torturing their neighbors for hidden bread, stood in that room and could not speak. They turned and walked out. Word spread through the city. Story reached the Roman camp. Titus, when he heard, swore, and Josephus records the oath, that he would bury this kind of horror beneath the ruins of the city itself, that a country that had produced such a moment was a country whose institutions deserved to come down. This is one of the passages where Josephus stops being a historian for a moment and writes as a man who watched his city die. By early July, the Romans had brought their siege works against the Antonia fortress, the great citadel that Herod had built on the rock of the northwest corner of the temple platform. The Antonia had been the Roman garrison base since the time of the procurators. It was the key to the temple. If Antonia fell, the temple was inside the inner ring of the Roman siege weapons. The defenders, led by John Gischala personally, fought the assault on Antonia for days. They mined under the Roman siege banks and collapsed them. They sortied at night with burning torches. They killed siege engineers in the dark. On the night of the 2nd of July, John's engineers tunneled under the largest of the Roman siege ramps and set fire to the props. The whole bank, weeks of labor by thousands of Roman engineers, collapsed in flames. Titus, in fury, brought up new troops and built new banks. By the night of the 5th of Av, the 24th of July by our reckoning, the Antonia fell to the Romans. The Roman troops stood on the platform looking down at the temple itself. Josephus, throughout this section of Book 5, returns again and again to the same diagnosis. He is, as much as any Jewish writer from his generation, convinced that what is destroying Jerusalem is not Rome. It is the sedition, stasis, the men inside the walls who refuse to listen to peace, who burn each other's grain, who torture their neighbors for hidden bread, who shoot arrows at the man pleading with them from the Roman side because his uniform is now wrong. He says this in different words a dozen times across Book 5. Let me give you one of them. Quote, although the seditious had 10,000 reasons every day to lay down their arms, yet they were hindered by the leaders of the factions, who would not by any means consent to it. Nay, they urged on their followers to fight more violently and turned their swords more against their own people than against the enemy. Unquote. Turned their swords more against their own people than against the enemy. That is a Jewish historian watching Jewish soldiers writing for a Roman audience and refusing to soften the line. He's not saying Rome was innocent. He is saying Rome was patient. The wound Jerusalem was bleeding from was the wound it had cut into itself in 66 AD, in 67 AD, 68 AD. In the winter storm, when the Idumeans came in the burning of the granaries, in the Passover massacre of Eleazar's faction in the inner temple, Titus arrived to finish a city that had been finishing itself for nearly 4 years. To bring us back to the present for a moment so that we can all understand what happened, the psychological and spiritual weather of a city under siege is not a metaphor. It is a real thing. Watchfulness without rest, a noise from the wrong direction that wakes the whole household. The sense, particularly in religious populations, that God is about to act in the next hour, and one must hold on until that hour comes. That weather is being lived right now across an unusually wide stretch of the same region. Josephus was writing about 2,000 years ago, and I want to name it honestly, on every side of the line, because the brand rule here is not to take political positions. It is to tell the truth. In Israel, the shelter rotations, the sirens, the missile barrages from Iran and Hezbollah rocket fire in the north, the fragile ceasefires that hold for weeks and then break, real families under real threat. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. In Gaza, 2 years of a war that has flattened much of the strip and killed civilians on a scale the region has not seen in living memory, real families under threat. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. In Lebanon, daily Israeli strikes across the south, ongoing displacement, hospitals hit, a population that has lived through more wars in one generation than most cities on earth. Real families under real threat. In Iran, the direct Israeli and American strike campaign of 2026 that has killed civilians, including, as widely reported, a group of schoolgirls at a girls' school in the middle of the Wide Exchange. Real families under real threat. I mention them all together because I have to. Christians live in every one of those places. The Palestinian Christian community in Gaza, nearly 2,000 years old, tracing back to the earliest church, has all but ceased to exist under the bombardment. The Assyrian and Armenian Christians of Iran number in the hundreds of thousands and worship in many places in secret. The Maronite Christians of Lebanon are direct inheritors of the early Christian world we have been walking through in this series. Our brothers and sisters in Christ live under all 4 skies. So do children of every other faith. And every one of those children, the Bible tells us, is fearfully and wonderfully made. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. Psalm 139:14. David wrote that of himself. It is true of every child who has ever been born, in every place, on every side of every line. When any of them dies in a war their fathers made, God sees it. He does not misfile them by nationality. He does not sort them by which flag they were born under. Josephus, watching Jerusalem tear itself apart in 70 AD, did not blame the Romans first. He blamed the factional leadership inside the walls, whose apocalyptic certainty and refusal to compromise dragged the population into a war they could not win. That was true then. The same diagnosis is available now, running on multiple sides of a wider regional war. Theological cover for political projects that would, if they succeeded, trigger something an order of magnitude worse than what we are already watching. The question Josephus puts on the table at the end of Book 5 is the same question the book has been putting on the table since Book 1. Do internal divisions still invite greater catastrophe? I do not answer it for you. He did not answer it for himself. He simply asked it in writing and trusted his readers to do the work. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Matthew 5:9. By the end of July 70 AD, by the early days of the month of Av in the Jewish calendar, Titus had broken through every layer of Jerusalem's outer defenses. The third wall was rubble. The second wall was rubble. The new city and the Bezatha suburbs had been burned and abandoned. The Antonia fortress had fallen, and Titus had ordered it pulled down to make a level approach to the temple platform. The defenders held the inner temple courts, the first wall in the upper city. They were starving. They were splintering. John's men and Simon's men were once again snipping at each other in the alleys. The civilian population was, by any modern definition, in collapse. And the holiest building in Judaism, the great Second Temple, the building Herod had spent 46 years rebuilding in his obsessive grief, the building Jesus had stood inside and warned would not have one stone left upon another, was now the final stronghold of the rebellion. It was a fortress. It was also a house of God. In 2 weeks, in the second week of Av, Titus would breach the inner courts. A torch would be thrown, possibly on his orders, most certainly against them, depending on which ancient source you believe. And the temple of the Lord would burn. Next week, episode 6, The Temple Burns, the day the world changed, August 70 AD. The fall of the temple, the fire, Titus's council of war and question of whether he ordered it or not, the final stand of John and Simon, the 1,000 trapped in the inner courts, the end of the daily sacrifice, the end, in real terms, of the world that had built a temple, and the survival of 2 communities of Jews who would carry their faith forward into a templeless world, the rabbis who would gather at Yavna, and the Christians who had already fled to Pella. Josephus stood close enough to feel the heat, so in a sense, we will. Spring 70 AD was the beginning of the end. Titus brought overwhelming force. The 4 legions and the auxiliaries and the engineers and the siege engines did what Roman armies always did, for the cold competence Rome was famous for. But Josephus, who watched it from the wrong side of the line, insists in every chapter of Book 5 that the real destroyer of Jerusalem was not the Roman who built the wall around it. It was the division inside. The echoes of his diagnosis: holy city under siege, factional collapse, false prophets wooing frightened populations, fragile ceasefires, the multi-front pressures of a small country surrounded by old enemies, still rhyme uncomfortably with headlines you have been reading this week. Again, history does not repeat. It certainly knows how to rhyme. And he shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines, and pestilence, and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Matthew 24, 6-8. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Revelation 2:10. I'm Nat, and this is the fall of Jerusalem. See you inside the walls.